Welcome to Lecture 3 of the Pentateuch. This lecture will cover Part 2 of the book of Genesis. Picking back up where we left off in our course notes, Roman numeral 3, Cain becomes the first murderer. Letter A, Cain murders his brother Abel. The first two children of Adam and Eve that are mentioned in this passage are Cain, whose name means acquire, and Abel, whose name means nothing or keeper. Though we must remember, they are probably not their first two children together, and definitely not their only children. Since this is a book of firsts, then only the ones needing to be included are listed. We find out here that Cain worked the ground as a farmer, while Abel took care of the sheep as a herdsman. Well, eventually, both Cain and Abel brought an offering to God. Cain brought the first fruit of the ground, while Abel brought the best firstlings of his flock. God showed favor to Abel's sacrifice, but not to Cain. This was most likely because at this point, only a blood sacrifice was acceptable, and only Abel brought such offering. Now later, we will discover that the Lord will institute something called a meal offering that would allow fruit from the ground. Then, in verses 6 and 7, we find out that this favoring of Abel's sacrifice enraged Cain so much that God lovingly approached Cain by asking him why he was mad, and then explained that if he had brought the proper sacrifice, then he too would have been accepted. Instead of repenting, Cain took his own brother's life. In other words, Cain would rather remove the competition than better his own game. Letter B. Because of this, God curses Cain. God asked Cain where his brother was, but Cain uses a play on words to say that he is not his brother's keeper. This is wordplay off of the meaning of Abel's name. And then in verse 12, since Abel's blood was shed on the ground, the curse was that Cain would no longer be able to produce fruit in the ground, which would be a very tough punishment for a farmer. Also, he would be a fugitive, which is a wanderer or a mover, and a vagabond, denoting he would be going back and forth in the land. Cain believed the punishment was too harsh, and others would try to kill him, so God placed a mark upon Cain so that anyone who killed him would have a sevenfold punishment against him. Now, this mark is best understood as a unique mark for Cain and for Cain only, and for none of his descendants, which we will find out very soon why that is the case. Then letter C, Cain's genealogy is emphasized. Interestingly, Cain left and lived in the land of Nod, which Nod means wandering. Most notably in Cain's genealogy are Enoch, who was the master builder, not the Enoch who was translated, and Lamech, the one who murdered an individual, supposing that Cain's protection would apply to him more than tenfold, which this just shows the depravity of Cain's lineage. And finally, letter D, Eve gives birth to Seth. The name Seth means appointed. He was named this as a testimony to God blessing Eve with another child after Abel's death. Seth's children are the ones said to begin calling on the name of the Lord instead of living for themselves, as Cain's children were apparently doing. Roman numeral 4, the listing of Seth's godly lineage. Seth was born to Adam when he was 130 years old. Adam lived 800 years after Seth was born, meaning he died at 930 years. Most notable in Seth's lineage are Enoch, who walked with God and was intimate in such a way that at 365 years old, God translated him and took him directly to heaven. Methuselah, who was the son of Enoch and the oldest man in the Bible to live to be 969 years old. Lamech, the son of Methuselah and father of Noah. And then finally, Noah, the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Roman numeral 5. God commands Noah to build an ark. Letter A. Mankind begins to increase in wickedness. Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 and 2 says, "When man began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives as they chose." From these two verses, the question has arisen as to the identity of the sons of God. Now, there are four main theories concerning who the sons of God were in these two verses. The first is known as the angelic interpretation. These individuals believe that these were angels who were copulating with human women. The second theory is known as the Sethite interpretation. Those who adhere to this theory believe that the sons of God were the godly line of Seth, who intermarried with the ungodly line of Cain. The third view is known as the rulers or nobles interpretation. These individuals believe that the sons of God were the rulers, kings, or nobles of the land, marrying normal women. And then finally is known as the possessed men view. This view believes that these were literal humans possessed by fallen angels who wanted to copulate with human women. Now, for your discussion forum this week, your assignment will be to do some more research on this view and these theories, and to determine which one you believe to be the most biblical. Continuing in our reading of the book of Genesis chapter 6, in verse 3 it says, "The Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 100 years. The wickedness of man not only grieved the Lord, but also made him put a limitation on the age of mankind. That limitation was 120 years. Then in verse 4 it says, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown." These giants, or Nephilim, which means fallen ones or princes, but not necessarily fallen angels, because we will find out later that the Israelites saw the Anakim, which are the sons of Anak, in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, and concluded that they were Nephilim themselves. But there's no way they could be connected to the acts here in verses 1 and 2. And then finally in verse 8 it says, "But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." In spite of all the wickedness in the land, God relented of making mankind, but one individual did find grace. Then, letter B, Noah obeys God's command to build an ark. On account of the corruptness and violence of the people on the earth, God told Noah he would destroy the people in it by a great flood. Therefore, Noah needed to build an ark to save his family and the animals. But he was not only supposed to build the ark, but also get enough food for his family and the animals. Which this leads us perfectly to Roman numeral 6. God destroys the earth through a worldwide flood. Not only were the animals to be brought two by two, but the clean animals and birds were brought by sevens for sacrifice. This shows that even before the written law, some law was already known. If not, how would Noah which ones were for sacrifice? Then we find out in verse 11 that this flood came from above and below. And the flood lasted for 40 days, and it went 22.5 feet above the mountains. This means that it could not have been a local flood, since it would have abated so much quicker. Then, after the 40 days of rain, the water stayed on the earth for 150 total days. Then, Roman numeral 7, the waters from the flood abate from the earth. 150 days later, the waters began to move off the land by a strong wind. Since this was a gradual process, Noah began to use birds to test whether there was enough dry land to sustain life on it. First, he sent out a raven that came back. Then a dove, which also returned. Then a dove again, which this time returned with an olive branch, signifying plant growth on the land. And finally, a dove again, but this time it did not return. After these things, God told Noah to take his family and all the animals off the ark, and for them all to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. In response to this, Noah built an altar and offered sacrifice from the clean animals. Interestingly, this sweet-smelling sacrifice is what motivated God to promise never to destroy the earth with a flood again. In Roman numeral 8, God makes a covenant with Noah. Letter A. God gives Noah new guidelines for his age or for his time period. The first was that he and his family were to multiply and replenish the earth, which this was nothing new. Secondly, the Lord said that they could eat any animal as long as there was no blood in the meat. Thirdly, God said that the animals would now fear mankind. And then finally, the penalty for murder is now death. And then letter B, God gives Noah and his sons the rainbow as a sign of his covenant. The rainbow was given as a sign that God would never again destroy the earth with a flood. And interestingly, in verse 19 we find out that the entire earth was populated by the sons of Noah. Therefore, once again, we have further proof that this was a worldwide flood and not a local flood, as some people theorize. In letter C, Noah gets drunk. Noah took up farming and planted grapes to make wine, because we find out here that he gets drunk on his own drink. Some surmise that this was most likely accidental because the entire atmosphere and environment of the earth were most likely changed, and thereby the fermentation process was probably sped up. However, this may be unlikely because at this point, Ham already had a son, and Noah would probably have already discovered this. Whatever the case, Ham discovers that his father is not only drunk, but he's also naked. He then tells his two brothers, Shem and Japheth, and they lay a garment on Noah, but without looking. In letter D, Noah curses Ham's son, Canaan. When Noah awakes, he realizes what Ham has done and curses his son, Canaan, with being the servant to Shem and even Japheth. Much speculation has been given about exactly what Ham did wrong. Some believe he had some sexual depravity in the viewing of his father's nakedness. Others, they believe that he was wrong in not taking care of his father's indiscretion himself, but instead including his two brothers in the issue. However, the text is not clear on this, so much of this is just speculation. Another interesting aspect pertains to the curse of Canaan. This most likely represents the future prophecy of the Israeli conquest of the land of Canaan. Roman numeral 9. Genesis chapter 10 gives us the listings of the genealogies of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The sons of Japheth appear to spread toward the European area. Also, The descendants of Ham appear to inhabit the African areas. A notable individual in Ham's lineage is the mighty hunter Nimrod, whose name means "let us revolt." Babel is said to be his kingdom. That's some more foreshadowing. Then finally, the descendants of Shem appeared to inhabit the Middle Eastern and Asian areas of the earth. Roman numeral 10. God institutes various languages at Shinar. At this point, everyone spoke the same language. In the area of Shinar, which is Babylon, the people had clustered together and devised a plan to make a name for themselves by building a great building and thereby keeping themselves from spreading out. In response to this, the Lord confounded the languages, thereby forcing them to spread out and fill the earth as commanded through Noah. This event caused the area to be named Babel, meaning confusion. After this record, we are then introduced to a descendant of Seth named Abram, who lived in Ur, which is an area of Mesopotamia, and Abram lived with his barren wife Sarai. From Ur, Terah, which is Abram's father at this point, took them to Haran. Roman numeral 11. Genesis chapters 11 through 20 detail the life of a man named Abram, whose name will be changed to Abraham. Letter A. God calls Abram from Haran. Number 1. God initiates a covenant with Abram. By following God through faith, Abraham was promised to be a great nation, have a great name, be a blessing to those who blessed him or a cursing to those who cursed him, and the land of Canaan. This was all done when Abram was 75 years old. Number 2. Abram lies to Pharaoh about Sarai. Because of a famine, Abram was driven to Egypt. But for fear of Sarai's beauty, Abram instructed her to tell the Egyptians that she was his sister so they would not be killed. Now, as weird as this sounds, they did have the same father, but not the same mother. This still makes it a lie, because he was not truly and fully trusting the promise of God and manipulating the situation to protect himself. On account of this lie, Pharaoh took her into his house and rewarded Abram with much livestock. This implies that Pharaoh most likely copulated with Sarai. Unfortunately, the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house because of this, and he realized that Abram had lied to him about Sarai. He then chastises Abram and sends them both away. Letter B. Abram and Lot depart ways. Number 1. Strife develops between Abram and Lot's herdsmen. At this point, Abram was extremely rich and had much wealth. Likewise did his nephew Lot. Since the land was not big enough where they were to sustain both groups, the herdsmen of Abram and Lot's cattle began to fight. Because of this, Abram tries to bring peace to the situation by telling Lot to pick anywhere he wants to dwell, and he would choose another. Lot chose to dwell in the land of Sodom, where they were sinners before the Lord exceedingly, while Abram chose the land of Canaan. And secondly, God promises the land of Canaan to Abram. While in Canaan, God told Abram to look in all directions, and everything that he saw would be given to him. In addition to this, he was also told that his seed would be innumerable as the dust of the earth. Letter C. Abram exercises militaristic strength. Number 1. Abram rescues Lot from captivity. A massive battle was taking place near the Salt Sea, and the king of Sodom fell to Kedorlaomer, the king of Elam. He took possessions of Sodom, which included Lot and his goods. Word got to Abram of Lot's capture, so he took 318 armed, trained servants, defeated the imprisoners, and took back Lot and his goods and all the people with him. Secondly, Abram meets Melchizedek. After leaving the battle, Abram met a priest of the Most High God called Melchizedek. His name literally means King of Righteousness, and he was most likely what we call a Christophany, or a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. Hebrews chapter 7 tells us that he was the King of Righteousness, the King of Salem, which means peace. He was without father or mother, and he was without children. And he also did not have a beginning nor end of life, but was made like unto the Son of God and a continual priest. Melchizedek then blessed Abram, and Abram paid tithes to Melchizedek, even before the Levitical establishment of the tithe was made. Thirdly, the king of Sodom attempts to reward Abram. The king of Sodom wanted to give Abram possessions for a slaughter of the other kings, but Abram refused to take anything from him, so that no one could ever say that Abram got his possessions from him. Letter D, God makes a covenant with Abram. Number 1, God promises Abram a physical heir. While in a vision, Abram reasoned with God that he had no heir for God's promise to be fulfilled, unless it would go through his servant Eliezer of Damascus. God said that Eliezer would not receive the promise, but that Abram would have a physical son to receive the blessing. Abram then believed the Lord at his word, and the Bible records that it was counted to him for righteousness. While this may appear to be a statement of believing faith, this may have been already evident when Abram left Haran for Canaan only at God's word. Secondly, God solidifies the covenant with a sacrifice. God told Abram to take a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old she-goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon, cut them in half, except for the birds, lay each half on the other side of him, and then the Lord put Abram in a deep sleep and passed through the pieces alone. According to the custom of their time, this signified that the covenant between Abram and God was completely dependent upon God and not Abram. Also, while in this deep sleep, the Lord prophesied to Abram that his seed would be in a strange land as slaves for 400 years, but they would one day be delivered. This is an obvious prophecy of the Egyptian bondage his people would go through. Letter E. Hagar gives birth to Ishmael. 10 years after the original promise of a descendant in Genesis chapter 12, making Abram 85 now, and since Sarai was still childless, she urged Abram to have a child with her Egyptian handmaid, Hagar. Abram does so, and Hagar gets pregnant. This caused Sarai to despise Hagar and ask Abram for a resolution. Abram tells Sarai to do whatever she wants to Hagar. After being treated harshly by Sarai, Hagar fled the land, but the angel of the Lord appeared to her with a promise of blessing upon Ishmael. This is most likely another Christophany. Hagar is then told to return and submit to Sarai, and God would multiply Ishmael's seed, and he would be a wild and antagonistic people. The angel even tells her to name the child Ishmael, which means God hears. Later, we will discover that he marries an Egyptian, and she has 12 sons who become the 12 princes of the Arabs. Ishmael was then born when Abram was probably around 86 years old. Letter F. Circumcision becomes the sign of the Abrahamic covenant. Number 1. God changes Abram's name to Abraham. Abram means exalted father in Hebrew, while Abraham means father of a nation or father of a multitude. Here, God then reiterates that Abram would be the father of many nations. He would be exceedingly fruitful, and he would have a dynastic lineage. This everlasting covenant is also said to be to him and his seed only. Secondly, God commands Abram to circumcise all the males. This is to be done once a son is 8 days old. But those who were older, and Abraham is 99 at the time, were supposed to be circumcised immediately. In fact, God said that anyone not circumcised was to be cut off from the people, which, admittedly, this is a very ironic choice of words by God himself. Thirdly, God changes Sarai's name to Sarah. Sarai means my lady. Sarah means princess. God also promises to give her a child, but Abraham falls on his face and laughs because he says he is almost 100 years old, and Sarah is 90. Abraham then asked if the promise could go through Ishmael instead, but God refused and said it will only go through Sarah's son. And fourthly, Abraham obeys God. Abraham was circumcised at 99 years old. Ishmael was 13, and all the other men of his house were circumcised as well. Letter G. God appears to Abraham. Number 1. God brings 2 angels with him to visit Abraham. Verse 1 declares that God himself came to meet Abraham. And from the context, we realize that the other 2 men with God are angels because they will eventually leave God and Abraham to go to Sodom to warn Lot. Once Abraham realizes who these men are, he begged them to stay so that he could feed them. Abraham then tells Sarah to get bread made, and he gets a young man to prepare a calf with butter and milk. Secondly, God promises Sarah a son, but she laughs. When the Lord told Abraham that Sarah would have a son, she was by the door listening. And when she heard it, the Bible says that she laughed within herself and then spoke to herself, saying that she and her husband were far too old for this to be true. The reason for her doubt was because the Bible says that it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. In other words, she was no longer menstruating, and that is the process that allows reproduction to even be possible. After this, the Lord then asked Abraham why Sarah laughed, but Sarah denied it. Thirdly, God tells Abraham that Sodom and Gomorrah will be judged. In verses 17 and 18, God literally tells Abraham that he did not want to keep secrets from him. So he proceeded to say that the 2 cities would be judged on account of their very grievous sins. In response to this, number 4, Abraham negotiates with God over Sodom. Most likely because Lot and his family lived there, Abraham first asks if God would still destroy the city if there were 50 righteous people. God said he would not do that if there were 50. Then Abraham went to 45, then 40, then 30, then 20, then 10. And God promised to not destroy the city for even 10 righteous people in it. Interestingly, 2 Peter records that only Lot was the righteous person in the city of Sodom. After this, the Lord then left. Letter H. God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. Number 1. 2 angels warn Lot of the coming judgment. The 2 angels went to Sodom, and Lot met with them and asked them to stay at his house. At first, they were going to stay in the streets, but Lot convinced them to stay with him. However, before they can even go to sleep for the night, the men of the city, both young and old, came to the house to have sex with the 2 angels. They just thought they were 2 normal, new, traveling men. Lot then begged the people not to do anything to them because they were his guests. But instead, he offered up his 2 virgin daughters in their stead. The men got even angry because they said Lot was an outsider trying to tell them what to do, and warned him that his fate would now be worse than the 2 men's. Thankfully, the angels pulled Lot back in the house, struck the perverts with blindness, and told Lot to get his family ready to leave there because God had sent them to destroy the city. Horrifically, this punishment of blindness would have made the fire even more terrifying, since they would not see it coming and not know where to go to try and avoid it. Secondly, Lot flees the city with his family. In the morning, the angels actually took Lot and his family by the hand and led them out of the city because Lot was lingering there. But God, in his mercy, did not want them to die. They then instructed them to leave, not even look back, and escape to the mountain. However, Lot bargained with the angels by saying that he would die if he went into the mountains, so he should go to a little city called Zoar. The angels then gave approval and spared that city because of Lot. Thirdly, Lot's wife is punished for disobedience. After Lot was safely away from the cities, God rained down fire and brimstone upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Unfortunately, Lot's wife looked back toward the city, and she was turned into a pillar of salt. Looking back at verse 17 of this passage, the punishment for looking back was consumption by the same judgment of the city. Therefore, this may mean she was hit by a firebrand and turned to ashes. Jewish tradition says that this might be an ironic and idiomatic expression because they believe she went around bitterly the night of the angel's visit, asking for salt to season their food because they had guests, thereby notifying the people of their visit. Therefore, she died the same way she lived, salty. Meanwhile, this was all going on, so Abraham got up in the morning, looked toward the cities, and saw the destruction being poured down upon them. Fourthly, Lot's daughters copulate with him. Ironically, Lot left the city of Zoar for the mountains for fear of his life, which was what the angels told him to do originally and may have saved his wife's life. While there, his daughters were worried because Lot had no seed after them. This may imply that any other children Lot had stayed in Sodom and died. Therefore, they devised a plan to get him drunk and sleep with him. The eldest the first night, and the youngest the second night. They both ended up getting pregnant, and the eldest bore a son named Moab, and the youngest a son named Ammon. Now, Moab and Ammon are the forefathers of two ruthless nations toward Israel. And finally, letter I. Abraham lies to Abimelech. When Abraham got to the land of Gerar, which was a city of the Philistines, he again told Sarah to tell everyone that she was his sister. On account of this, Abimelech, which Abimelech is just a title meaning father of a king, he took Sarah to be his wife. But the Lord stopped him in a dream by declaring that she was married and that if he touched her, then he and his family would die. Abimelech reasoned with the Lord, saying that he was a righteous individual and only did this because he was told she was Abraham's sister. God acknowledged this and even declared that he kept him from touching Sarah so that he would not be punished. The next morning, Abimelech called his servants, told them what happened, and fearfully called Abraham to question why he had done this. Abraham reasoned that since she was his father's daughter, but not his mother's, that he was telling the truth. But ultimately, he did this because he did not think the people there feared God, and they would kill him. Abimelech told Abraham to dwell anywhere in the land that he wanted, and then told Sarah that he had given Abraham 1,000 pieces of silver. This caused Abraham to pray for Abimelech, which was exactly what God told Abimelech Abraham would do because he was a prophet. This prayer of Abraham allowed God to heal Abimelech's family of being barren. Interestingly, Sarah was obviously an attractive, almost 90-year-old woman for this to happen again. And that brings us to the end of Lecture 3 for the Pentateuch.